Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we speak, could we follow my example and turn off your cell phones, please? Today it's my pleasure to introduce a man who has been in the news, or at least the news in my part of the world, in Australia, for a long time. The former head of the Cambodia National Rescue Party. That party has now been abolished by the government in Cambodia. So he says, he calls himself the leader of the Cambodia National Rescue Movement. And he says it himself, a movement cannot be suppressed. It will last forever, we hope. But he is a former Minister of Finance. He is currently living in France. The current regime, the Hun Sen regime, well, he's been, I think you've been exiled twice, haven't you, in your career?
5 times.
5 times, heavens, we lose count. And the man who took his place is currently, Kem Sokha, is currently in jail. So obviously things are not very happy there. And as you know, we had Deborah Kisha, from the Cambodia Daily, which has now been suppressed, the newspaper there, speaking to the club just a few months ago. With we also have from the Jiminto, Mr. Fujita Yukihisa, the director of the Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defence, and also a member of the House of Councillors. And travelling with Mr. Rainsy, 3 of his colleagues, they were sitting here today, Sam Samura Chulong, Sikua Mu, and Tok Van Chan, the member of the Permanent Committee of the CNRP. With no more ado, can I invite you to address us about the situation in your country?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank to all the participants for your interest for Cambodia and for your compassion for the Cambodian people. It's a great honor to be invited again at the Foreign Correspondent Club of Japan. I was here about 25 years ago. I was Minister of Finance, and it was Mr. Bernard Krischer who received me, and I know that his daughter Dobra is still active around here. I would like to start our discussion by paying respect and by recalling the case of 3 journalists in Cambodia who are in jail presently. One is James Ricketson, an Australian filmmaker who has been detained for about a year and who is actually held hostage by the Hun Sen regime in order to prevent foreign journalists from writing a critical report about the Hun Sen regime. The 2 other journalists in jail are Cambodians. They work for Radio Free Asia. So Hun Sen has closed down Radio Free Asia. He has expelled some organizations such as the National Democratic Institute, NDI, but those 2 journalists were not fast enough to run away, and they find themselves in jail. I'm sure that journalists all over the world will help to ensure the release of James Ricketson and the 2 Cambodian journalists working for Radio Free Asia. Again, thank you very much for your presence here. I am going to be brief in order to leave time for questions. The situation in Cambodia has deteriorated very sharply and very recently, actually. We are now in an unprecedented situation because in a few months after the election, general election set for 29th of July, in 3 months, Cambodia is going to have an illegitimate government. So this will be contrary to the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia, signed by 18 countries, and also by 4 fighting factions, Cambodian factions, signed in 1991, whereby the international community has committed itself to ensuring that Cambodia will move on the democratic path following a democratic process. But now this democratic process has derailed, and we are doing our best, and we are calling on our friends from all over the world to help restore the democratic process and to ensure that the next election will be acceptably free and fair, will be a real election, not a fake election. If it is a fake election, yes, Cambodia will definitely lose, any government of Cambodia will lose legitimacy following such a fake election. And to achieve this, to ensure real elections, and associated with the release of the leader of the opposition, Mr. Kem Sokha, the president of the Cambodia National Rescue Party, the only viable and credible opposition in Cambodia, who is in jail now after the party has been dissolved. The party has been dissolved. All the leaders, 118 leaders of the party, have been banned from politics, and our seats at the National Assembly, we have obtained 55 seats, approximately half of the total of the National Assembly. Our seats have been taken and redistributed to smaller parties who have not obtained any seats at all at the previous election. And we have also over 5,000 commune, we call it commune councillors, who are part of local government. So we have strong roots at the countryside, but all those seats have also been confiscated and be redistributed, not now, this time not to smaller parties, but to the ruling party itself, meaning that the ruling party control 100% of the local government. So this is very undemocratic, as you can see. In such difficult circumstances, we call on our friends, and we have just come to Tokyo to ask the Japanese government, the Japanese press, to call on the Japanese public opinion, NGOs, etc., to help restore the democratic process. Japan has played a prominent role since the very beginning, even before the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement on Cambodia in 1991. Japan, and especially Tokyo, was the venue of discussion. Cambodian faction fighting against each other met in Tokyo in order to lay the ground for further dialogue leading to the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement. And a few years later, in 1997, there was a coup d'etat, because after the first ever democratic elections in Cambodia organized by the United Nations, whereby the opposition won, and Mr. Hun Sen's party lost. So Mr. Hun Sen a few years later staged a coup d'etat. Then there was a crisis which was solved only with the help of the Japanese government. Japanese official re-established the dialogue and ensure that there would be acceptable election the following year in 1998. So this time, 20 years later, this is not a military coup, but it is an institutional coup. Institutional coup, it's with the same result, whereby the constitution is suspended, all the fundamental freedoms have been suspended, and Mr. Hun Sen, our Prime Minister, all of the sudden decided to change the rules of the game. He decided to stop any competitive election, any democratic election. The cause of the problem is that Mr. Hun Sen has realized that he would lose any real elections. The opposition started 25 years ago with the presence of the United Nations. Actually, I started the first parliamentary opposition party. I was alone, only one member of parliament. But subsequently, I took part in different elections. From one member of parliament, we went up to 15. From 15, we went up to 24. From 24, we went up to 29 members of parliament. And at the last election in 2013, we obtained 55 seats at the National Assembly, very close to the ruling party. And according to independent observers, they said that were the election really free and fair, the opposition would have won already, and the ruling party started to actually to panic. They realized that they would not tolerate any other election. The one that is precisely set for 29th of July. Therefore, Mr. Hun Sen decided to suppress the opposition, suppress by declaring the opposition illegal, by levying charge, ludicrous charge that we betrayed our country, we plot with the USA, the CIA to overthrow his government, but nobody believes in such a politically motivated charge. So on such a ludicrous charge, he dissolved the only opposition party. He put our president in jail, as I have just, and he want to hold election in 3 months' time without the presence of the opposition, and this has led to a strong reaction and uproar from the international community. The United States have decided to withdraw any assistance to the organization of the election. The same with the European Unions. Both US and European Union have decided to take sanctions. It is the first ever sanctions that have been taken, because we all realize that this is an unprecedented situation. Mr. Hun Sen has crossed the red line with his very anti-democratic moves. Actually, he has killed democracy in Cambodia, and it is very sad, because what we have now is before Mr. Hun Sen's recent move, it was the result of a hard work by the international community. Over the last 25 years, countries like Japan has invested so much. Japan was the first donor country. When I was finance minister, I signed a cooperation agreement with the Japanese government, and I can measure how generous Japan was. But what is more even touching, there were 2 Japanese nationals who gave their life for peace and democracy in Cambodia. One is a UN volunteer, the other one is a civilian policeman. When they took part in the peacekeeping operation in Cambodia, they got killed by the Khmer Rouge. So we will never forget the sacrifices by the Japanese people. And Japan has been very generous in helping building infrastructure in Cambodia, in helping clear personal landmine, and helping to precisely to ensure that the country is reconstructed after war, years of war, institution building, etc. All this legacy is going to be lost if we don't put back on track the democratic process. I am very grateful to the Japanese people, to Japanese government, to the Japanese journalists, NGOs, etc. JICA and many other NGOs have been very, very active in Cambodia. So on behalf of the Cambodian people who have benefited from such generosity from Japan, I call on the Japanese government, on the Japanese people to help restore the democratic process in Cambodia. So I would end this and leave time for questions.
Thank you very much for that. I should add another Japanese connection, namely Akashi-san.
Yes, very much so. Yes, when the UN intervened, it was the largest ever peacekeeping operation decided by the United Nations to restore peace in Cambodia and to lay the foundation for democracy in Cambodia. The UN called its mission UNTAC, United Nations Transitional Authority in Cambodia, and the head of UNTAC was Mr. Yasushi Akashi. He did a very, very brilliant job, and it was a big success. The UN succeeded in organizing the first ever democratic election in Cambodia. Peace was restored, and the foundations for democracy was effectively led. And the name of Mr. Yasushi Akashi is inscribed in gold letters in Cambodia's history. So this is another reason why it would be very sad if all this legacy is let to be destroyed by our current government in Cambodia.
Akashi-san now heads the International House of Japan in Azabu. Well, thank you very much for your speech. I'm sure there's a lot to ask about. Do we have any questions from the floor? Please state your affiliation and your name. Thank you. Please.
Do you want me to walk up?
NHK の別府と申します。My name is Shoichiro Beppu from NHK. My question is about, are you basically calling for the Japanese government to withdraw the elections assistance, that is, unlike the EU and the United States? And related to that, the Japanese government's position is basically saying that with this assistance that the country is doing toward Cambodia, it still has a link or some kind of influence with the Hun Sen administrations, and they don't want to risk to even lose that small influence through this assistance. But having said that, yet do you still think that this assistance should be cancelled? Thank you.
We understand the position of Japan, because contrary to the US, contrary to the European Union, Japan is a regional power. It's in the region, so she has to defend her interests as part of the region. And Japan has made a lot of investment. The business community has invested heavily in Cambodia. So Japan has some considerations that the US or the EU does not have. And I think because of that, I think it is rather positive with the fact that Japan has maintained a good relation with all Cambodian parties. Therefore, she is well placed to play the role of an intermediary to help establish or re-establish dialogue between the different Cambodian parties, as she has done in the past, as I have just recalled recently. And Mr. Hun Sen needs the involvement of Japan, because what is the most important factor is legitimacy. Again, with the withdrawal of the US, withdrawal of the European Union, the 27 countries of Europe, only Japan maintain a link between the Hun Sen regime, and behind the Hun Sen regime is China, with the world community of democratic nations. If Japan withdraw, Hun Sen will be totally isolated, and Cambodia will be really in trouble, because a small and weak and poor country like Cambodia, that is so dependent for her survival on international community, no Cambodian government can survive with the loss of legitimacy. Therefore, things are what they are now. Japan has a strong leverage to help restore the democratic process, and to make all parties understand that we all have interest for the very interest, the higher interest of our country, of Cambodia's interest, is that to help ensure that Japan remain in the process. And if Japan cannot help, nobody can help now. Only Japan can help restore this democratic process. It is why we call on, we have been meeting many members of parliament from the ruling party, from the opposition parties, from Mr. Komura. Komura was in Komura. He was deputy foreign minister in 1997. He was the man who helped re-establish a dialogue and help reach a political solution. So there are a lot of competent people, experienced people, knowledgeable people within the Japanese government who could help. So in short, I think Japan is in a unique position to help Cambodia.
Thanks. We had a question. Yes, please.
Siegfried Little, freelancer from Germany. Could you tell us something about the relations to Vietnam and China? And the second question is, China is thinking of building a lot of dams in the Mekong area. I think this is not good for the development of the economy of Cambodia.
Yes.
Could you tell us about this problem also?
Yes. The current situation is reminiscent of the situation 40, 45 years ago under the Khmer Rouge, under Pol Pot. Pol Pot, because of his not only anti-democratic but murderous regime, was isolated from the rest of the world, and only China support Pol Pot, support the Khmer Rouge. And we find now many similarities because of Hun Sen undemocratic crackdown on the opposition. Hun Sen is isolating Cambodia from the world community of democratic nations, and only China supports Hun Sen, and the Cambodian people are very unhappy, very angry against that, because it reminds us of the situation under the Khmer Rouge. China seems not to pay any attention to human rights violation, to democratic principles being violated. So China wants to penetrate at any cost in Cambodia. And China is very happy to break the solidarity among ASEAN, and China is using Cambodia to break solidarity among ASEAN, because China does not want to negotiate with ASEAN as a whole, as such as an organization, to address issues related to the South China Sea, for instance. China wants to negotiate bilaterally, to divide and to have negotiators facing China that is weaker. So China is using Hun Sen. Each time when there is any negotiation between China and ASEAN, Hun Sen block any joint statement calling for solidarity among ASEAN and condemning China for her assertive policy in the South China Sea. Also, China is using Hun Sen to attack the US, and this is very reminiscent of the Khmer Rouge also. Now, since because of tension between the US and China is increasing, China finds very expedient to have an ally who is attacking the US. So the opposition has been dissolved now because Hun Sen accused us of plotting with America, with the CIA to overthrow Hun Sen. It is what Pol Pot did. Now Hun Sen do the same thing with China behind. And also China is using Cambodia to have facilities more including, I think it would be more and more apparent, military facilities. I think this will threaten many countries in the region, starting with Japan, Vietnam, Australia, India. So the geopolitics is also a factor to be considered, that Hun Sen cannot side with China with total impunity, not only at the detriment of the Cambodian people in terms of violation of human rights, but when it comes to security for the whole region, Hun Sen is playing a very dangerous game. And about building a dam in Tibet, China is building dams without any consideration how it could negatively affect countries downstream. Of course, affect Vietnam, but also affect Cambodia, and the livelihood of millions of Cambodians are being jeopardized by the negative effect of China building dams in Tibet upstream. Sorry?
Relation to Vietnam, you can tell about the relation.
So the situation is changing. It is why when we want to analyze and try to predict what would happen. This is an unprecedented situation. Anything can happen now. We remember that the Hun Sen regime was put in power, was installed by Vietnam, by a Vietnamese invading and occupation army. And Hun Sen was perceived as being very close to Vietnam. But we have heard that Vietnam is not very happy with the way Hun Sen is ruling the country. And Hun Sen is very unhappy when Vietnam gives him some advice. He said, it is not good that you stay in power for such a long period of time. Hun Sen is actually the longest serving Prime Minister and the longest serving leaders in the world. He has been in power for 33 years. And Vietnam say it is not good to do that. Even in communist countries like Vietnam and China, the leader should stay 5 years, 10 years at most. If you stay that long, it could affect the image, the popularity, and the stability of the regime. But Hun Sen Sen does not want to listen to that. And second, because Vietnam is close, I think she can afford to give such advice to Hun Sen. Second, Vietnam advised Hun Sen about corruption. That in Vietnam, even in China, they address corruption. But Cambodia is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, according to Transparency International and according to Global Witness. The economy of Cambodia is controlled by Hun Sen's family, his daughter, his wife, etc. So Vietnam dares to make such a recommendation to Hun Sen. He is not happy. But Hun Sen, actually, his concern is to cling on to power at any cost, and he cannot accept the democratic elections. And because of his this kind of position, even the facade of democracy has crumbled. So there is a condemnation from the Western world. So Hun Sen needs compensation, financial compensation. Vietnam cannot provide the amount of financial aid that the West used to provide to Cambodia. So Hun Sen turns to China, and China can give massive aid, and this makes Vietnam unhappy for different reasons: internal reason, external reason, and as I have just said, breaking the solidarity among ASEAN and siding with China in the conflict between Vietnam and China related to the South China Sea. For all these reasons, we know that Vietnam is not happy, and Vietnam has still strong influence over Cambodia after 10 years of military occupation of Cambodia in the 80s. You can understand that Vietnam has maintained a network, military network, intelligence network in Cambodia, and Vietnam is in the position to trigger a change. Vietnam will not help the democratic opposition, but within the ruling party in Cambodia, there are different factions, and Vietnam could help one of the faction topple Hun Sen and install a more pro-Vietnamese faction within the current ruling former communist party. So the situation in Cambodia is very unstable. Hun Sen will not remain in power forever, and China will not control Cambodia forever.
Have we any more questions here? You mentioned there are factions in Vietnam which may not be happy with Hun Sen. Are you in contact with any of those factions?
No. It's we are not directly in contact, but indirectly we know that a system. It is not only a one-party system. It is a one-man system. And more than that, Hun Sen wants to found a political dynasty. The only example would be North Korea. I think Hun Sen looks up to North Korea as a model because he's preparing his sons. He said, I will stay. Before he said, I will stay in a few years, and then my sons, he has 3 sons, will take over. But he must realize that his children are not capable yet of replacing him. Then he declares he will remain in power until he is 90. He's only 65, 66, so we have to wait according to his plan to endure 35 years more of personal power. But I think this is wishful thinking. It's totally unrealistic.
Do we have any more questions? You mentioned that initially China was the only country that supported the Khmer Rouge.
Yes.
Later, America and Australia recognized the Khmer Rouge as the rulers, as the legitimate rulers. What did you feel at the time when that happened?
I think this is the result of the Cold War. And it is why, in predicting the evolution of Cambodia, we have to take in consideration the international, the regional environment, the geopolitics. The situation has changed. The war in Cambodia stopped, and the Paris Peace Agreement was signed in 1991. What happened in 1991? 1991 was the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was behind Vietnam in invading Cambodia, in controlling Cambodia. And in reaction, there was China. China was confronting the US. And there was the US also. It's a very paradoxical situation. But this situation ended. Things returned to normal with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union has told Vietnam that we cannot support you anymore. Russia is a new regime now. Then Vietnam accepted to make peace with China, with the US. But now the environment has changed in the sense that it returned Hun Sen from Vietnam now side with China. Vietnam will be more and more critical, will more challenge the Hun Sen regime. So this has totally changed with the role of China being perceived as controversial. Anything can happen in Cambodia given the new geopolitics.
Thank you. Yes.
If I may.
Yes, of course. There was another question?
Talking about your understanding of Japan's unique position, as you mentioned, towards Cambodia.
This is from NHK.
Yes.
I'm from NHK once again. And since there's no one else, I'm lowering myself to ask you another question. But in that given unique role, do you think that Japan or Tokyo is doing enough? And if not, what else do you think Tokyo should or could do more? And another follow-up question is, if the elections will go ahead without any real presence of an opposition party, what kind of actions are you planning to take?
In Asia, it's very important in any political solution to ensure that nobody lose a face. I think Japan understands this very well. It is why Japan follows a different approach. Japanese diplomacy is more discreet. You don't need to be to make things loudly. It could be discreet. It could be behind the scene. It's a soft approach because since there is no other possible approach that we can be relied on, I think this is the only approach that is left. And I personally believe that it can be effective because first, Japan maintain the only country that maintain only democratic country that maintain dialogue with Hun Sen, and also Japan has leverage without saying it. Hun Sen knows that Hun Sen has to take into account any demand from Japan, because Japan hold the key for maintaining any form of legitimacy. If Japan say that this election is not legitimate, and therefore any government formed after such an election is not legitimate. Therefore, this will not happen yet. I hope it never happen. But Hun Sen would understand that if Japan now join the rest of the democratic nations, join to the US, join the European Union to declare, and it is a matter of fact that an election without opposition is meaningless and cannot be recognized. Therefore, Hun Sen will be in deep trouble. So, making Hun Sen understand that Hun Sen must consider any Japan's initiative to ensure that the next election in 3 months will be more open with the participation of the opposition, and then to ensure legitimacy for the future government. Only Japan now can convince Hun Sen to come back to some democratic form of election and of government in Cambodia. So it can be very effective.
And your actions, what are you going to take? What kinds of actions are you going to take if the elections will go ahead without any credible presence of an opposition?
So this is the worst case scenario. I think we hope, because Hun Sen understand that he will be in deep trouble if he does not pay attention to an initiative, a possible initiative. I don't know what initiative is being taken, if any, but if there is any initiative to open up the election process, he is Hun Sen last chance also to maintain, to ensure legitimacy for his government. Otherwise, I think the situation will be heading toward instability, toward a lot of problem. You see, I have been leading the opposition for 25 years. I have convinced my people to remain patient, that we should refrain from violence and we should wait for the election. And it is why at each election the opposition has moving up. And if Hun Sen does not allow the opposition to take place, how can I say, how I convince my people to be patient, to refrain from violence, to wait for what? We have been waiting for election each term, and we have been winning election. Now we come close to power, and all of the sudden, when the Cambodian people is told there is no more election, the opposition will not be able to participate, then what can we predict? It can be an eruption of violence. You cannot make people patient for 25 years and forever. And now people know that they should be empowered, that the will of the people should be respected. And you can understand the reaction of the people. Hun Sen reverse the democratic process. We have suffered a lot since I formed the opposition party. 80 members of my supporters have been killed, assassinated. The fate of an opposition leaders, there is only three possibilities. Either you get assassinated, so I have many colleagues who were assassinated. I myself escaped several assassination attempts. Or second possibility, you get jailed. I was forced to take refuge at the UN office, at the American embassy, at it's a kind of detention. And my successor, Kem Sokha, is in jail, and many of my colleagues are in jail. Also, members of the civil societies are in jail. Journalists are in jail. So this is the second possible fate. The third fate is exile. So I have been in exile 5 times in exile, but experience proves that we must remain optimistic. My last exile lasts until 9 days before the previous election, before voting day of the previous election. So we have 3 months to go. So I am still hopeful, because with the right intervention, the right environment, there can be a solution any time. So it is important to maintain the possibility of democratic election. It is the only way to ensure peace and stability for the country. And especially in Japan, I met with the business community. They are very worried. The business community wants stability for the country in order to make long-term plan. And they know that they realize that the situation in Cambodia now is very volatile. So this is very detrimental to the situation, the economic situation. We need jobs, we need sustainable development, and we need Japanese investors. But the Japanese investors are reluctant now. We cannot invest in such an environment. So all Cambodian parties should understand that the interest of the country is to ensure stability, and stability now rests on democracy. There is a new definition of stability. Before 20 years ago, stability rests on a very strong power, authoritarian power, dictatorship. This was the kind of stability. Even some businessmen accept that kind of stability. But now nobody accepts the stability of playing, the changing the rule of the game. We were on the democratic path. All of a sudden, we changed the rules of the game, say no more democracy, no more election, and people understand that this the risk of violence, the risk of instability. So the interest of Cambodia, all Cambodia ASEAN party, the risk of the Cambodia's neighboring countries is to ensure stability in Cambodia based on democracy.
Thank you. There was another question? Yes. Oh, sorry. You're the working press. Thank you. Can you identify yourself?
My name is Masako Zaki from Kyodo News.
From?
Kyodo News.
Kyodo.
Kyodo. I have a follow-up question from the reporter from NHK. If the election should go on, and if there is an election on July 29th without the opposition party running, will you be calling your supporters to boycott the election? Is that an option that you will be taking?
Yes, but there is a if and a big if. So definitely, if Hun Sen maintains the election and continue to discard the opposition, we will have to call on the boycott. And this will it will further undermine the legitimacy of such an election. An election without the participation of the opposition, and I just reminded it is the only credible opposition party. Hun Sen may put forward smaller parties that he's control and pretend to be, this is a multi-party system, but nobody will be fooled. It requires a real election requires the participation of the CNRP. So if the CNRP is not allowed to participate, then we would call for a boycott, and this will further delegitimize the election because the voter turnout will be low. Voter turnout is used to be very high in Cambodia. 80, 90, 95%. It's very, very high. Why? Because the Cambodian people understand that any election in Cambodia is actually a choice of society you want to live in. It is not a choice between two parties that are more or less the same with only small differences, fine-tuning. No, this is a big difference. Do you want to live in an authoritarian, a communist style, one-party system ruled by one man, by one family, very corrupt, a lot of social injustice? Or do you want to live in a more democratic society, with fundamental freedoms ensured, with better governance, with social justice, especially the young people? What we have not discussed is that Cambodia now is not the Cambodia that used to be 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, where Hun Sen were very strong. Cambodia is now a new country, a new nation, a new people. With the young people, Cambodia has a very young population. 70% of the population is under 20, and this is the result of the baby boom. The baby boom brought about by the United Nations, by Mr. Akashi. But when the United Nations intervened, the prospects was, it's peace now. We are going to have good lives, better lives. Then they make babies, and the baby booms now is the result. Those people, they are in their 20s, early 20s, and they are different people. The young people, they are more educated, they are more technology savvy, they are more demanding, they are more critical, they can compare. Hun Sen used to make people compare to the Khmer Rouge. Hun Sen was strong at a time. 10 years, 20 years after the Khmer Rouge, Hun Sen he said, what do you want? You are better off than under the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge were hell. Now we are elected with better than hell. But you want to return to the Khmer Rouge system? Everybody, people was afraid. Say, okay, we vote for Hun Sen. But if you ask the people now, the large majority, 70-80% of the population, they say, no, we don't compare our current situation with the Khmer Rouge. The young people, they look forward, they don't look backward. So the Hun Sen propaganda does not hold anymore, because the young people, they have information, they compare Cambodia to neighboring countries, to the rest of the world. They compare Cambodia to its potential that is far from being achieved. So they have a reason to want a democratic change. We push, the young people push for a democratic change, and actually Hun Sen is fighting a rearguard battle. The longer Hun Sen stays in power, the more anachronistic his regime becomes. And we can understand, all his crackdown is inspired by one thing, by fear, because he knows that the whole country is against him. He cannot afford to play the democratic game anymore. All of a sudden, he has to change the rules of the game. He let the democratic facade crumble, and he said, no more election, no more opposition. So this will create a lot of problem. Cambodia will be in deep trouble, and in the international community is right to follow that closely and not to allow Hun Sen to change the rule of the game and to totally destroy democracy. This would have far-reaching consequences, not only in Cambodia, in the whole region. We have talked about the role of Vietnam, of Asia, of Japan, of Australia. I think this will have far-reaching consequences. So people more and more realize that there must do something in Cambodia when it is still time to put things right.
Thank you. You have a question? Can you identify yourself?
Kaori Hitomi from AP, Mr. Rainsy. So I'm following up the lady's question. So what do you mean exactly by waking up your people if things does not go as you wish? And also you mentioned that the whole Cambodia is against Hun Sen, Mr. Hun Sen. And how much of confidence do you have in the assessment? How much of confidence do you have in the assessment?
Yeah. So we are not going to participate in an electoral farce. If the opposition is not allowed to take part, why should we call our supporters to vote? To vote for who? There is no alternative to vote for Hun Sen, but we have been fighting Hun Sen for 25 years. To vote for one of the smaller parties that Hun Sen has created, that Hun Sen supported behind, in order to fool the international community that this is a real election. This is not a real choice. The choice is between Hun Sen and the CNRP. So if the CNRP is not allowed to participate, we call on a boycott. And you will see, if we call on a boycott, the voter turnout will go down. From 80-90%, it will go down. So it will further undermine the legitimacy of such election. And it will further undermine any government that would stem from such an election. And this will make Cambodia make the Hun Sen government position untenable. And what was the question? The other question, sorry.
And how confident are you that the whole Cambodia is?
No, sorry, I didn't want the whole Cambodia. Cambodia's development has benefited to a small segment of the population. Hun Sen's family, the apparatchik, the civil servant, the corrupt people, and those who benefited from the clientelism. So I would not say the whole, but I would say the vast majority of the Cambodian people, they understand. If you look at the demography, the demographic factors, the social factors, things have changed. Before, Cambodia was a rural society, and in a rural society, people live in fear because people are isolated. The ruling party, they have their network, they spy, and in every house they spy, and people are afraid. Now, with the industrialization, people come to live in the city. In the city, people are less afraid. When they go to work, they go to factories together, they live nearby, so they are less afraid. But what is more important is the education. They have more information now. With Facebook, with radio, they have Facebook, and with travel. Cambodian people cannot find job, so they go abroad. They go back and forth. When they go abroad to Thailand, to Malaysia, to South Korea, they see the difference between a democratic country with a country like Cambodia. So they tell their people, they tell their colleague, it is time. We cannot live under the same system. Look, the world goes forward. We remain poor. We remain a backward country. So you don't need any party to convince them. They know, but the party, the CNRP, is there to give the opportunity that yes, if you want to change, the democratic change has a name. It is CNRP. So it is not the whole country, but I would say 70%. 70%, and it is a matter of education also. The more people get educated, they will realize the need for a democratic change. But Hun Sen maintains Cambodia in a beggar mentality. Himself gives the example. Each time when Hun Sen travel, he asked, when he come to Japan, he asked for assistance. He never talked about trade, but he talks about aid. Only give. But Cambodia now needs investment, needs trade, and the key word is productivity. To have productivity to ensure competitivity, and Cambodia's economy is virtually bankrupt because the result of years and years of decades of negligence, of neglect, of corruption, of incompetence leaves Cambodia's economy in a very poor state. In all industries, the productivity is very low. We cannot compete. If you look at the trade balance, it has a heavier and heavier deficit in the trade balance. We would be bankrupt already if there were not loans. So we badly need some loans, and in order to contract loans, we need legitimacy, because when you make a loan to Hun Sen, to make a loan to a legitimate government of Cambodia. But when Hun Sen lose legitimacy, who is going to give loan to a legitimate government? The U.S. government, Washington, has also given instruction to its representative at the World Bank to suspend, not allow the World Bank to make further loans to Cambodia. Japan has a lot of influence. Japan has influence on Asian development banks in Manila. So I think we all have a legal teams that how the World Bank, how the Asian Development Bank are going to continue to provide loans to an illegitimate government, and this will precipitate, and the moment of truth will come, that with a virtually bankrupt economy that has no more loans from the international community, the economy, Cambodian economy, will be in deep trouble. And Hun Sen now, his last resort is China. So we are borrowing, Hun Sen is borrowing loans, incredible amount of loans from China. But China has also some worries now. We have received different indication whereby China also has concern about the stability of the Cambodian regime, and don't believe that China can replace the West. Never. Cambodia's economy rely on one single industry, the garment industry, and garment, shoes, etc., represent 80% of the country's export. And the only two buyers of garment from Cambodia are the United States and the European Union, not China. China buy nothing from Cambodia. China is a competitor to Cambodia. China sells the same products to the West as Cambodia. So China cannot replace the West. So Hun Sen is a bluffer when he said, oh, we don't care, we don't need the West. China can help us. No. If you analyze the structure of Cambodia's economy, China cannot replace the West. So it is why the West has the democratic countries. Unfortunately, maybe it is we cannot do anything now. Have lost contact. Only Japan can still summarize all the arguments we have developed here and convince Hun Sen that he should now come back to the democratic path and allow the CNRP to take part in the election and release all political prisoners, especially the president of our party.
Any more questions? I think just one small question, Mr. Rainsy.
Yes.
What do you think of the Chinese gambling resort being set up in Sihanoukville?
What I can tell is to report to you the reaction of the Cambodian people. The Cambodian people are very angry because for the first time we see many Chinese, not only investors, but all segments of the population. Chinese people from all walks of life. The workers, the sellers, all kind of mafia people, a lot of money from China. And we know that this corruption money is in China. They cannot spend in China. So it is something unique to have a country, a legitimate government in Cambodia. So they send all the money, the corruption money, the dirty money, the black money to launder. Cambodia's largest industry is actually money laundering. And they have so much money, they buy anything in Cambodia. Hun Sen allows the Chinese to buy anything. So the Cambodian people are very unhappy because price increase, the land increase, and they cannot afford to have land to have their own house. But the Chinese is buying everything, and they are everywhere. They take the jobs of the ordinary Cambodian people. So I think this will have consequences. Hun Sen is playing with fire. By siding with China, Hun Sen is playing with fire.
Thank you very much for that. Well, with that, we'll call an end to our meeting, and thank you very much for giving us the time to come here today. Thank you.
Thank you.